I can't brake with my... oh. It's the Twike! But you already know that because you've already seen the video where I tell you everything about this and how silly it is. But that video was shot in the future. Presently, it's the past. And right now, the Twike is inoperable, and it needs some work. The canopy needs some resealing and reattaching. I popped out the rear window to get better access to the goings-on back here, but it's not in the best shape, so I need to make a new rear window for it. But most importantly, the battery pack is shot, so I need to build a new one for it. Although even if it wasn't shot, I'd probably still build a new pack for it because the way they designed this battery pack is not good or safe. So let's do those things. That didn't latch. Let's do something about this canopy now. That was too easy, which is why I need to fix it. All of these scuffed areas around the edge and down the center spine is where it's supposed to be painted black, and where it was painted black at one point in time, but as you can see, most of that paint has fallen off. So I need to remove the remaining paint, what little of it is left, mask off the areas that are not supposed to have paint, and then reapply black paint where there should be black paint. And while that's drying, I should probably start scraping off the adhesive. That looks good, even if I do say so myself. It's not glued in yet. I'm going to give the paint more time to cure to give it a better chance of holding on, and I probably need someone to help me lower this down into place without smearing the adhesive all over the place. But the paint job looks good. There we go. There we go. Got it. Several days later, some cosmetic issues have popped up with the canopy. What I think happened is the windshield adhesive that I used, as it cured, contracted slightly, and there's some places where the paint is pulling away from the canopy. It is still very firmly glued in place. It is basically irremovable right now, so I'm not going to do anything about it, but you can see where the paint is being slightly tugged away from the canopy, and it really bothers me. Two things that make me feel better about this, though. Twike also screwed this up. That's why I had to re-glue the canopy, because all of the paint detached from the canopy. And the second thing is, it looks better than when I started. So, success. Now onto the battery pack, but first let me show you all the high voltage gubbins in the Twike. This is the main reason I popped out the rear window. It makes it much easier to access all the crap back here. First of all, yes, the wiring is a mess, but that is the battery tray running the entire width of the car, leaving very little space on either side of it. This, with all the wires going into it, is the main high voltage and everything else control board. And this is the DC to DC converter. From the other side, you can see the front of the tray. This is what Twike calls a BMS. That's where all the thermistors go into, and there's some logic and some cutoff in there. That's the existing charger that I will be bypassing. And that's about it, really. This is the entire battery pack out of the Twike. Just 3.5 kilowatt hours. Not very big. Originally, the Twike had a nickel cadmium or nickel metal hydride battery, I'm not really sure, and this is the factory lithium upgrade option from Twike. Each module is a 4P14S configuration of 18650 cells. There's 7 modules in total, wired in series for a total pack nominal voltage of 362 volts. Easily the highest voltage to capacity ratio I've ever seen. Luckily, the reason they went with such a high voltage on such a small vehicle is because the peak power draw on the Twike's motor is only 9 kilowatts, if it's even that, and because this is such a high voltage, the amperage is basically nothing, and they could get away with these tiny little wires for the main high voltage connections. So what's wrong with it? Why am I saying this battery pack is a bad design and unsafe? Well, if you're a battery enthusiast, you probably already noticed what's missing. Each one of these modules here has 2 wires coming out of it, a positive and a negative, and nothing else. There's no battery management system. There's no individual cell monitoring at all. If you're not familiar with the job of a BMS or battery management system, it'll have a balance lead going to each individual cell in the overall series. So it can monitor each cell group's voltage individually to prevent overcharging, over-discharging, and to keep all of the cells balanced to the same voltage. Because the Twike doesn't have a BMS, it has no idea what each individual cell voltage is, and it has no way to keep the cells in balance. So when it charges, it just charges to an overall pack target voltage, and the charger will just keep dumping in current until that overall pack target voltage is met. In normal operation, this is totally fine. The cells aren't going to drift apart very much. They'll stay mostly in balance all on their own without any external help, and when you go to charge them, they'll all end up roughly at 4.2 volts, all on their own. The problem is those pesky edge cases. Let's say in an extreme example, you got one cell that has a significantly lower voltage than the rest of the pack. The charger doesn't know that, so it's still going to target the same charging voltage for the sum of the pack, because that one cell is lower than the rest of them. To bring up the sum voltage for the rest of the pack, the rest of the cells have to be overcharged. Or for a different scenario, you could have a couple of cells that are slightly higher voltage than the rest of the pack. Again, the charger's just looking at the sum total voltage. You could have a couple of cells that are significantly overcharged. Overcharging damages the battery, but more importantly, it can cause a thermal event. In fairness, the cylindrical style cell that Twike chose to build the battery pack out of is less prone to outright fire than a pouch style cell like this one I pulled out of a phone. And overcharging is something the previous owner of this Twike experienced. He put his Twike in storage while he moved, and unbeknownst to him, several of the cells in his battery pack dropped down to 0 volts. I don't know why, but the heavy corrosion here might have something to do with it. Several months later, he pulled his Twike out of storage, and again, he didn't know that several of the cells had dropped to 0 volts, so he hooked it up to charge, and the ignorant onboard charger overcharged the vast majority of the cells in his battery pack. Thankfully, though, nothing happened. Well, nothing catastrophic anyway. I mean, his battery pack was toast, but given this, it's probably not in the best shape to begin with. To give Twike just a little bit of credit, while there is no individual cell monitoring, there is no BMS, there are thermistors to monitor battery temperature, and one of the series connections in each one of the modules is made up by a couple thermal fuses, so your Twike's battery probably won't burst into flames, but it's still not a good design. So for the new battery pack that I'm going to build for this Twike, I'm going to add a proper BMS that can do all of the individual cell level monitoring, and I'm going to add a new charger that communicates with that BMS so the BMS can tell the charger to stop charging if it detects anything off whatsoever. It's not just a safety thing either. Having properly balanced cells means you have a better battery pack. If the cells go all out of whack, it reduces its usable capacity. Building a new pack starts with sourcing new battery cells. I didn't want to pay a fortune for brand new 18650s or 2170s and then build a new pack completely from scratch, so I went to batteryhookup.com, browsed their inventory, and ended up with this. This is a battery module from I have no idea what. Battery Hookup must have bought these wholesale or surplus or something. Importantly, the cells inside are 18650s. They've never been cycled, so they're brand new. There is a 2-cell BMS inside here, but I'm not interested in that, nor am I interested in the connector. And this was only $100 per kilowatt hour, which for brand new cells is awesome. I'm also not interested in any of this plastic casing, so let's remove the cells. First with this plastic strip that covers the cell taps. And then this should just pop right off. And there is the small BMS board with connector. Again, I'm not interested in any of that. Now I can throw this away. Holding these two halves together are a bunch of screws. Cut the label in half because that's still retaining the two halves together. And then the cells inside this module are in a 2S10P configuration. I know it looks like there's 12 cells on each side, but the two middle cells are actually just inert pieces of plastic for spacing. These are labeled 2600 milliamp hour, which is 2.6 amp hours, but I didn't just believe that at face value. I took one of these modules apart previously, fully charged each bank of cells up to 4.2 volts, and then capacity tested them down to 2.8 volts, and the actual capacity I got out of them was 2.65 amp hours, so these are in perfect shape. The pack I took out of the Twike was in a 98S configuration. I intend to replicate that, so I bought 49 of these 2S modules. The first step I'm already working on in the other room. I'm bottom balancing all of the cells, which means I'm individually discharging each one of these cell banks down to 2.8 volts using the capacity testers I just showed you. That way, when I assemble the battery pack, all of these will start out at the same state of charge and the same voltage. The first step to building this new battery pack is to take these small modules and group them together into slightly larger modules. These cells are all spot welded together, but on the other side, because this is how connections work, they're bifurcated in the middle. So to join these two halves together, I'm just going to squirt some high-strength hot glue in the middle here. To add a little more strength and to support these spot welds, I'm going to put some glue on the edges too, between the cells. And to be clear, this bead of hot glue that I ran on the perimeter between each cell is not necessary. It's the belt and suspenders approach. Now to stack these units together, again, using hot glue. And by the way, if you think that this is too big of a task for hot glue, just know you're wrong. I glued that module in backwards. Okay, these modules are permanently bonded together. The only way I could think to remove them, I did try a knife, it didn't work at all, is with a hot wire cutter, which is about $100 on Amazon. So I weighed that price against the price of these modules, which was $18.50 per module. So I bought 3 new modules. I'm going to forget these exist, and I'm going to be more careful from now on. Hey, it's me from the future. I made that mistake more times, but if I wasn't an idiot, I would have realized I didn't have to order brand new modules and remake the stack anytime I glued one on backwards. All I have to do is cut the series connection in the middle of the nickel strip and then remake that series connection on the other side. Boom, I flipped it. Anyway, back to ignorant past Robert. Okay, there we go. Making the series connections between these cell groups would normally mean nickel strip and a battery spot welder. I'm not going to do that. The design of these modules allows me to use a method that doesn't require any specialty tooling. Soldering to the ends of battery cells is a bad idea because that's a lot of heat being dumped into the cell for a prolonged period of time, which damages it. But in each one of these cell groups are 2 plastic cells, so I can make all my solder connections here on top of these plastic cells and not worry about damaging any of the battery cells. There will be some heat transfer over, obviously, but not enough to damage anything. On the backside of these modules, the series connections are made by these nickel strip bridges, bridging between the 2 halves of the modules. Now, I calculated the current carrying capacity of these little 0.15 millimeter nickel strip bridges here, all 4 of them combined, and it's about 20 amps, give or take. The Twike will be pulling more like 30 amps, so I'm going to reinforce these with the jumper wire going across to give it a little bit of extra current carrying ability. Now to solder on all the individual cell balance leads that will lead up to the BMS satellite that'll sit right about here. The nice thing about this Thunderstruck BMS I'm using is that these 2 separate wire harnesses, despite going into the same BMS, are completely independent, which makes wire management so much easier. Each half of the module gets its own cell balance lead wiring harness. All right, that's done. Now I need to validate that I put them all in the right place with this little harness test board here and a voltmeter. Just need to make sure the voltages go up in order and I didn't skip or rearrange one. 33. All right, they are all validated. Now it's time to stack these 2 halves on top of each other, and to separate them I've just cut this ABS sheet on the table saw, tacked on this little extra bit because it was too short, and to provide some cushion I've lined this with, well, it's just rubber window seal, if I'm honest. I think for the remainder of these modules I make, instead of soldering jumpers on the back, I'm going to break out the spot welder so these can sit more flatly against each other, but this works fine for now. I'm going to put an ABS shield on both sides of the module as well as wrap the whole thing up, but first I need to solder on this wire that connects the 2 halves together and the positive and negative lead that come out the top of the module. Done. Now to answer the inevitable question, why didn't you use heat shrink battery wrap? And on the bottom, I put on some of this rubber mat for abrasion resistance where it's going to be sitting. And finally, I added some thermistors to the back of the module. They connect to the harness up here that plugs into the BMS satellite, and it was a pain in the butt to put these in because this harness that connects to the BMS satellite is pre-wired. So you got to take the little thermistor end tip and solder it on to the cut wires. Thankfully, this job was made easier by my little heat shrink connectors with the solder built into them. Once the connections are made, I can slide it under the heat shrink battery wrap and then tape the wires in place with Kapton tape that smells like urine. That's 1 module done. Now I need to will 4 more into existence. Oh, that one's all weird. I made some slight improvements as I went along. On the first 2, as you saw, I soldered on a wire to increase the current carrying ability of the nickel strip on the back, and then took up the remaining gap with this rubber window seal. On the remaining 3, I just spot welded on some extra nickel strips so these 2 sections fit more closely together, and I didn't need the rubber window seal between the 2 halves. All of the modules are in a 20S configuration with the exception of this one, which is 18S, because I wanted the whole battery pack to be in a 98S configuration, just like the battery pack I took out of the Twike. It would have been much more pleasing to make all these modules the same size and make the battery pack 100S and just increase the voltage by these 2 extra cell groups. But I don't know how the Twike's computer would play well with that 2 extra cells worth of voltage. Very likely wouldn't do anything at all, especially since I'm not reusing the Twike stock charger, but I don't know, so I played it safe and went with the same configuration I took out of it. The capacity of this new pack? 9 kilowatt hours gross, almost triple the capacity of the original pack. BMS time. Just like with my previous lithium converted mower project, I'll be using components from Thunderstruck Motors. Not sponsored, and I paid for it myself. I just really like their stuff. I'll be using 5 of these BMS 24 BMS satellite units, one for each module. To control the BMS and the charger, I'm using their MCU, or Master Control Unit. And this is the new charger I'm going with, the TSM 2500, also from Thunderstruck. TSM is just Thunderstruck Motors. This is a 2.5 kilowatt charger, plenty for this application. 3 days later, here's my bench test setup. I've got my 5 BMS satellites all wired up and strapped to their respective modules. I've got an MCU to control everything. I've got the charger, and I have a J1772 port. And when I plug in the charging cable, it works! I've got it turned down to 5 amps for now, but it do work. This is a very basic and easy setup. The reason it took me so long to get it working is because I had a few issues along the way. When I first wired up these 5 satellites, the MCU did not see the last unit in the daisy chain. I even tried switching the modules. It was consistently the last satellite that it wouldn't see. So I emailed Thunderstruck about this, and it turns out 4 satellite units is the limit of one daisy chain, so at least one of these had to be moved to the second bus on the board. I chose to wire 2 of them on the bus because, I don't know, it looks nicer. Once I got all the BMS satellites to properly communicate, I encountered another issue. First of all, the cell voltages weren't all quite as similar as I expected, given that I bottom balanced all the cells beforehand, but there were 2 cells in particular that were dramatically higher than the rest of them because somehow I forgot to bottom balance beforehand, so I had to do that while they were in the module, which was easy enough to do. I just used the BMS harness tester board as a breakout board to individually discharge the 2 offending cells. But because these cell tap wires and the traces on that board are so thin, I only discharged them at 1 amp compared to the 3 amps that I discharged all the rest of the cells in this pack at for bottom balancing. And that's a problem because the lower draw you put on the cell, the more you'll get out of it. So when I got everything hooked back up together, rather than those 2 cells being at 3.4 volts like the rest of the pack, they were at 3.1. So I had to then charge them back up again a little bit to match the rest of the pack. And then I had a whoopsie. I accidentally touched 2 of these wires together, shorted them out, and then melted one of the traces on the cell harness test board right there. Fixed it. I tested the absolute limits of my soldering ability by soldering this jumper onto that tiny little surface mount pin down there. Once that was sorted, then I could charge those 2 cells up to 3.4 volts. Couple things I learned from this experience. One, I didn't need to bottom balance all the way down to the low voltage cutoff of 2.8 volts. I could have picked a higher value. I didn't need to drain the cells completely. And 2, and this is something the Thunderstruck guys told me, top balancing is more reliable. Rather than discharging all the cells to the same value, charging them up to the same voltage is more reliable. As I showed with these 2 cells here, if you discharge them at a different rate, they end up at a different place than all the rest of the cells. Because I bottom balance these, my voltages are kind of all over the place. If I type show cells, my voltages range from about 3.41 all the way to 3.44, which given I balanced these beforehand is not all that similar. The Thunderstruck BMS does have passive balancing though, which I can enable using enable balance. And now it will balance all the cells. And I just found out another new thing. BV min is the minimum voltage value the cells will balance at. Default was 4 volts. So I lowered that down to 3.5 volts, and now you can see all of the high cells that it's discharging using passive balancing. Okay, after about an hour and a half of charging with balancing enables, the cells are a lot more in line than they started out. Because I'm putting a new charger in here, you might think that I'll remove this old one, but no. For now, and possibly permanently, it's staying in there because I took the cover off and look at how many communication wires come out of the charger and go to the main logic board. I don't know what most of those do. The new charger also comes with another upgrade that I didn't think about. Originally, the Twike did not have dual voltage charging. For the US market, it was 120 volts or bust. But the previous owner of this upgraded it to dual voltage charging. Here's that upgrade. 2 extension cords hardwired to it. This one is for 120 volts, this one is for 240 volts. You have to switch between them with a toggle switch. All of this is that double extension cord mess with the toggle switch there and some other stuff. I will be removing all of this as well, but again, I'm going to wait to make sure all of the new stuff works first. The inputs I need from the Twike to the MCU are very simple. I just need power, ground, and a key switch input. The key switch input, I think I can just tap off of this on switch on the dash here, but the power and ground is actually a little more complicated because this has a 12 volt system, but it doesn't have a permanent 12 volt source. It doesn't have a battery, just has the DC to DC converter back there and no place to store that energy. So I have to add a battery to it. All right, I've been putting it off because I'm nervous, but let's go ahead and put the batteries in here. Right after I mount this on jack stands for safety. Off with your diaper or underpants. Now let's move on to putting the batteries in here. Right after I get some hardboard to fill out the floor. I'm gonna go with town real quick. This tray doesn't have a flat floor. This is sunk down below this angled lip, so I just cut this to give it a flat floor. Okay, now we can move on to putting the batteries in. Okay, negative most battery module, which I have labeled 1 neg. Now these modules barely fit with the BMS strapped on the front here, which is kind of perfect because it'll sandwich them in place. And I am going to reuse these thermistors because they're there. Why not go ahead and tape them back in place? The BMS, the charger, all that stuff isn't installed yet, but the high voltage is connected, so let's power on the Twike for the first time and see what happens. I don't know what's going to happen. Possibly nothing. Let's first trip the breaker. High voltage going live now. Nothing happened. Okay. Let's undo the, or open, or whatever. E-stop off. It's making noises! This is a thing! There's a light! This is the first time I've ever seen the Twike with power running through it. I'm discovering all sorts of things. You have to hear this blinker sound. It's the dumbest thing ever. What is that? Okay, we gotta try drive. We're gonna try drive. Let's put it in drive. What will happen? Nothing. All right, I couldn't figure out why the Twike wouldn't go into drive, so I called the previous owner, who has been extremely helpful in this project, and found out something. You know how I said this extension cord mess, I'm going to leave it be until I make sure everything works, and then I can slowly remove things? Well, that was true except for this. This is a little pigtail. It was only connected to the board with the ground wire going to a spade connector. I removed it because I looked at this and thought this is a vestigial charge cable. I don't need this anymore. I was wrong. This is the drive-away protection bypass loop. To make it go into drive, you take the 120 volt extension cable, which is here, and plug it into this so that it lets the Twike know that it's not charging anymore, and this connects to the board. You have to plug the Twike into itself right now to make it work. I'm going to make this better, but for now, let's just go ahead and do this so we can see spinny Twike wheels. It's in forward. Spinny wheels! Off camera, I made this bracket out of aluminum. I didn't film making it because I didn't feel like it. And that bracket goes right here. It's held in by these screws that go directly into the plastic, which I don't trust at all, so I'm using 6 of them. And being careful not to over-tighten them. On top are these 2 riv nuts, and I also put these 2 riv nuts back here. These riv nuts go into, again, plastic, which I don't super trust, so I put epoxy around them to keep the riv nuts from breaking free or spinning out. And on top of them sits the new Thunderstruck charger. I recognize that I'm biased, but I think this new install looks better than the old one. By the way, this box here that I've been referring to as the charger, it occurred to me at some point, this might also be the motor inverter. The charge port should go right about here. This feels so wrong. Here's the pinning of a J1772 port if you were curious. And now it all goes into here. All right, let's take the protective film off of this mounting tape that I added for waterproofing. All right, charge port installed. Wiring's done, and it's charging now. There's the new charger, there's the MCU, there's the charge port, and the charge port wiring going from the port to the charger. There's a bunch of new wiring going from the MCU to the everything else. There's a new relay I added, and there's an alarm buzzer. And there's the new 12-volt battery I added. Now let's back up a second so I can show you how I got here. I mentioned the Twike doesn't currently have a 12-volt battery, so I need to add one in order for the MCU to function properly. So to add one, I 3D printed this thing. Then I screwed these other things to the side of the thing I 3D printed, and that thing is a battery tray. And it goes into the Twike's existing battery tray where there's currently a gap. And here's that new 12-volt battery post wiring. For the key switch input required by the MCU, I removed this top panel out of the pod here, soldered a wire to the back of the power switch, fished that wire down through the back tube the pod is mounted on, which ended up being incredibly difficult and required the use of a borescope. You can see the reason I needed the borescope is because the bottom of this tube had a circular hole and I had trouble feeding the wire through that. but now it's in. And put the panel back in place. To keep the 12-volt battery I added charged up, I connected it up to the output of the DC to DC through a diode so the battery can't backfeed into the DC to DC. And something I just found out, that DC to DC converter on board is always active. Even with the Twike off and the e-stop button pressed in and activated, as long as the high voltage battery is connected, that DC to DC converter is putting out 12 volts. So really, I don't even think I needed to add the 12-volt battery. I'm glad I did. It's a more robust solution, but I don't think it was strictly necessary. I already showed you the nasty manual drive-away protection loop, where the Twike has to be plugged into itself in order to be able to go into drive. And when it's unplugged, that puts it into charge mode, and even with the switch off, the Twike is powered on for charging or whatever reason they had. I replaced all this nastiness with a relay. All that was happening when I plugged the Twike into itself was I was connecting a SPAY connector on the main board to ground. So I replaced the manual way of doing that with a normally closed relay that is triggered by an output on the MCU, an output that I have programmed to be active. In other words, the relay opens when I plug it into charge. So when I plug this into charge, you'll be able to hear the relay click and the Twike will come alive, which is what it did when charging for whatever reason. Low voltage cutoff. I didn't add one because I kinda can't with the way the Twike's configured. If I had a high voltage disconnect in there anyway to be triggered when there's a low voltage situation, the Twike would have to reboot. It's a whole thing. It wouldn't work properly. But I did add a low voltage alarm in the center console between the seats. I cut a hole, stuck an alarm in there, and now that buzzer is triggered by an output on the MCU that is programmed to be on if there's a low pack condition or a low voltage condition on any of the cells. Something else I changed is this key down here on the side of the center console. This was the high voltage cutoff trigger. That key, when turned, would trip this breaker here and disconnect the high voltage. Theoretically, anyway. The problem was you had to have power running through it for this remote key trigger to actually trip that breaker, and even then it wasn't 100% reliable. And then, to reactivate, to untrip the breaker, you still had to take the high voltage cover off everything to re-expose that breaker. So I've just disconnected the whole stupid key assembly, put a label above it that says this key does nothing, and now to disconnect or reconnect the high voltage, you have to access this breaker and hit the button on the top. The brake lights have an issue too. They do work, but the signaling to them is all faulty. The brake switch is bad, for one, but that's okay because the previous owner gave me 2 spare brake switches. And another problem is the connection to the board. There's a little plug down here, and the pins in that little plug are all wallered out. So I took the plug out, took a picture of it, sent it to a friend who's really good at identifying connectors, and within 5 minutes, he identified it properly, and I was able to order a new plug from DigiKey. Here's the new pins in the header I ordered. I crimped the pins on the end of the wire with my crimping tool, snapped the pins into the new header, and then soldered the new stub onto the end of the old brake switch cable. Job done. This brake switch is also bad. These 2 prongs work, but these 2 don't, and these are the ones that I need. So luckily I have a replacement right here. I put a silicone mat underneath this in case it leaks brake fluid, which I know it will. Now let's test it. When I press down on the brake pedal, this contact and this contact should close. And they don't. The previous owner of this gave me 2 brake switches, but turns out they were used. I cut one open to see what was wrong with it. The seal had leaked and the contacts were all corroded. So I went and bought a new brake switch. I looked up the part number on the back of this one. Turns out this is a brake switch for a Volkswagen Vanagon. So I went and found another. Let's install it. Now let's test it. Brake lights! All I needed was a new switch and a new plug back there. Good news! I got the Twike registered. Right, it is not ready. I still have a bunch of wiring to clean up. There's no rear window. I didn't put the mirrors back on or anything, but it's going to rain the next 2 days. And I want to take this thing for a test drive before it gets dark. My leg's already cramping. It's a good sign. Oh my God. I moved 2 inches. Whoa! Whoa, what a noise, too! Oh my God! Back pedal. Okay, we gotta try out the brakes. Oh, this is terrifying. Oh my God. I'm gonna drive this on the road. Oh my God, I'm doing it. Jesus. Shift. The shifter seems to not be doing anything. All right, that was 25. Jesus! No thank you. Oh, regen. Wow, the front end is so dirty. Holy crap. Oh my god. Holy crap, why is this front end so bad? I am never doing highway speeds in this. Absolutely no way it's happening. Oh my god. I think I kicked it out of gear. Yeah, the pedal's not doing anything. I can't brake with my... oh. Ah! Yes, that's right. The first time I ever drive the Twike on the road, I crash it. I drive it right off the road into a ditch, up an embankment. So what happened? Because I reviewed the footage after the accident, and it looked like I just decided to start panicking and have an accident. What happened was 3 things right in a row. The steering tiller locked up. You couldn't really tell this was happening on camera, but you could sure see the panic set in on my face when I realized the steering was locked up. Then I tried to push the brakes, at which point I realized my shoelaces were tangled in the bike chain and I couldn't push the brakes down anymore. And then in a panic, I tried to set the e-brake, but I got confused in the panic, and instead of pushing forward on it, I pulled back on it, which just releases it again. So yeah, I had an accident, and immediately following the accident, I was very confused and couldn't even figure out how to open the canopy. Where's the button? Wow, I just had an accident. Come on. Nothing was harmed on me or the Twike. Thankfully, before the test drive, I didn't reinstall the Aero underbody shielding down here. If I had reinstalled that before that test drive, that hill would have ripped it clean off. Okay, but how did the tiller spontaneously lock while I was driving it? Well, as it turns out, the Twike wasn't designed for fat American butts. Here's how the steering tiller lock works. You twist the key, and then you push down. When you push down, that's what engages the lock and keeps the tiller from moving past this position. Here's the key, here's my butt. I made a left turn before the tiller locked up, and this is how that turned out. I'm turning the key with my butt. And all I have to do is lean over a little bit, and I can very easily, with my butt, press down on this and lock the tiller in place. Thankfully, the tiller didn't lock in place. I was just holding down on that tumbler with my butt, and as soon as I got up off of it, when I hit the ditch, the tiller was unlocked again. But that was terrifying. From now on, I take the key out before I ever drive the Twike. Hey, it's me from the future. About that twitchy steering. After I released the last video, both the previous owner of my Twike and Twike the company reached out to me to let me know that my steering appears to be twitchier than normal. Twike even sent me a whole list of things that could possibly be wrong with my Twike, causing the extra twitchy steering. I haven't had time to go through this list yet, but I thought I'd let you know that apparently my steering is twitchier than normal in a Twike. Now back to the past. On to the rear window. To make a replacement window, I bought a piece of UV and scratch-resistant polycarbonate. To cut it to shape, I used the old window as a template and cut out the new window with a flush trim bit in the router. And to glue it in place, I used regular automotive windshield adhesive, which was probably overkill. Oh! Broke the tube open on the side. I guess I'm done putting it in there. This is my clamping mechanism to hold it in place while the polyurethane cures and makes my terrible job permanent. I then followed that up with a bead of black silicone around the edge to add prettiness and to fill in this lip that would have otherwise collected water. You probably already noticed in the previous video that that glue bead is visible and it looks awful. If I wasn't an idiot, I would have seen this coming and I would have put a vinyl border around the inside of the window to hide the glue seam like all car windshields do. But I am an idiot, and I didn't think to do that ahead of time. It's still totally possible to add a border to the inside now, but with the window in place, it's much harder to do so. So I'm just going to leave it for now. Whatever, it can look ugly. Speaking of unsightly glue-ups, the canopy. I was not happy with how the canopy looked. Where the paint was slightly pulling away from the canopy was unsightly, and it bothered me. So I covered it up with vinyl tape. Black vinyl tape over all of the areas where there was black paint underneath the canopy. This was super tedious, especially right here where I had to make it match this curve. To make it match this curve, I laid down masking tape to make my template, and then I peeled that shape up and placed it over vinyl wrap and cut out the vinyl wrap to match the masking tape template. It was a lot of work, but it looks so much better now. I'm very happy I did that. This is essentially a cover-up job, but it looks much better. There is one downside though. There's vinyl tape here where the windshield wiper sits. So if you use this windshield wiper, it'll swipe past the edges of this vinyl tape strip and slowly peel it up. And I'm totally okay with that, because if you use this windshield wiper on this polycarbonate, it'll scratch the absolute crap out of it, so I'm okay with use of the windshield wiper being decentivized. I removed all the old charge cabling. This was satisfying to get rid of. I cleaned up all the new wiring I added, and crucially, to signify the danger, all of the high voltage connections I've wrapped in orange tape. For configuration, I set the charger to charge up to 4.1 volts per cell, which is about 90% capacity for longevity. Low voltage cutoff is 3.3 volts, and while the charger is capable of 2.5 kilowatts of output, I have it turned down to 1.4 kilowatts on both 120 and 240. All of this is very easily changeable, should I decide to change it later. The electrical stuff is mostly done, but before I call it fully done, I need to fully charge it, fully discharge it, run it through some charge-discharge cycles, and just test it to make sure everything's okay. I'm not worried about the system that I added. I'm worried about how the system I added plays with the stock Twike computer. There could be some complications that I'm not aware of just yet, but that's going to wait because real winter has set in, and it's very cold and salty outside. And finally, this is the shelf that came with the Twike. It sat in the back, it covered all the high voltage bits, you could put your cargo in here, etc. Two problems with this shelf. One, the new battery pack that I built is taller than the old one by quite a substantial margin, which meant this is now too low and actually rubs on the high voltage cables on the top of the battery pack, which not ideal. The second problem with it is this is almost impossible to get in and out of the back of the Twike. My understanding is this was for safety, so you couldn't willy-nilly take the shelf out and have access to all the high voltage components, but I wanted to improve this. So I made my own shelf for the back of the Twike out of mahogany and aluminum. And I didn't record any of it because I thought it was just going to be a quick side quest. I don't know why I thought that. I spent 3 weeks on it. The new shelf is in 3, technically 4 pieces to make it easier to install in place. Here's the back piece that screws onto this back plate. You can see the 4 little L brackets coming off the bottom with rib nuts in them. That's where the back of the shelf sits and bolts into. Then there's the front piece, which sits just behind this support bar. I also added this laser cut piece of acrylic that's held in place by magnets. This is the access to the high voltage disconnect switch behind it. And finally, the shelf, which is hinged in the middle. You can see the underside of it. These are the brackets that bolt through here. And it's hinged in the middle, so I can actually get it in and out of there, unlike the old shelf, which was just an impossible puzzle. Like I said, I massively overdid that shelf, but I like it, so there. And that's it, it's done now. Like I said, I still have to do some high voltage validation testing and possibly some changes based on that testing, but by and large, it's done now. I spent so much more time and money than I thought I was going to on this stupid thing. I estimated in my head that it would take about a month to do everything. I spent almost that much time on just the shelf in the back. Again, that wasn't solid work, that was off and on work, but still. And as far as money goes, well, on the battery cells, that wasn't bad at all. I spent about $900 for 9 kilowatt hours. That's pretty good. But then there was the BMS, the MCU, the charger, the charge port, all of that stuff added up to about $3,000. And then there was all the extra wiring stuff that I had to get on top of that, plus all the other stuff that I did on the Twike, this new rear window, all the work I did on the canopy, the brake switches, some other stuff I'm probably forgetting. I think I spent about $4,500 restoring, essentially, this Twike, which, not worth it. No. I mean, will I get that much from the videos that I make on it? Also, probably not. So, it's an ill-advised project. But I'm really happy with the end result. I don't often get time to sink as much time as I want to into a project. I did get that opportunity with the Twike, and I kind of wish I hadn't. But anyway, it's ready to film the video that you've already seen now, so I'm going to go do that. Bye!